Hey guys, welcome to my beginner Python tutorials. I'm going to try to keep the videos between 5 and 15 minutes because I want to get straight to the point, explain what it is exactly that you can expect from the topic that I'm going over, and then just go kind of experiment on your own. I don't want to get too crazy with like underlying mechanics of how it may or may not work, just because that could be a little too in depth for just kind of getting into programming initially. And I think if you can just kind of know what things do versus why things are, it'll be much more functional as you start. When you are a little bit more experienced with it, then you can start going into the whys, and then it'll really like push your understanding of the language further. This video is about error handling. I'm not going to go into too much detail. I think the farthest I'll go is maybe just going. This video is about error handling. I'm going to try to keep this one simple. There's a lot more that you could do with this, but if you can understand the basics, whenever you need to do more complicated error handling, you can. So this should let you know, at least at a basic level, what it is you should be trying to do. So the beginning here, all I'm really doing is I'm just setting a number to an integer, and I'm trying to run an operation on it or do a method called to make it lowercase. And because it's an integer, it can't do this. It wants this to be a string. So it's going to raise an exception. And so what I do here is I just put except exception, and this is the error that you're looking for. So this is the base class for all non-exit exceptions. And then I'm saying as E. And what this is doing is it's taking whatever the exception is, the sentence that defines it, and it's setting it to that variable. So when I print E, I'm going to see what the error was. And if I want more detailed, I can do a full traceback, which you have to import. But if I do a full traceback, it's going to give me some information about where it happened and maybe a little bit more on why it happened. So I'm going to run this real quick so you can see the difference between just printing the exception and the traceback and what happens. Oops. Oh. Weird. Okay, so we see int object has no attribute lower, and then I drew a line, and now we get the traceback. So it's telling me in line 8, here's where the problem was. So when you're dealing with something like this, if you're going to be doing something where you're going to have a user input something, and maybe what they do shouldn't have happened, so you're going to give them an error, you don't want to give them this. This is something that you could use, but you don't want the user to know. So instead, you can give them something like this, but what I can do is change it, right? So because I have the power to do whatever I want here, as you can see, we're just printing the variable. I could say whatever error I want, so I can make my own error in place of it. I don't have any example of that, so let me just do that one more time. We could just say invalid input. Please make sure input is a string. So when that happened, it print out my little error there. And we don't have to print any of this stuff out. Then they're like, oh, okay, well, I put an integer in, I need to put a string in, and that will help them on the next time, you know, what they need to do. So the next part here is essentially the same, but what I'm doing is I'm actually using a more specific error. Because there's all different types of errors, I might want to handle them differently. So maybe on an attribute error, I want to show that give them an error, like saying, hey, you can't do that. And if it's like an exception, it's like, oh, we didn't know what was going to happen, unknown error. So what I'm doing here is I'm putting attribute error before, because this is actually an attribute error, what comes up. The exception, I'll catch all of it, but it's actually an attribute error, right? So I'm doing attribute error, and then I'm having it print the attribute error, and I'm just putting a 1 and a 2 in front just so you can see, you know for sure like which one is caught. So let me run this. So we could see here, because the more specific one was first, what it actually is, that caught it. It's not going to hit exception. So if you want to do this, which it's best practice to do more specific errors, you could leave the exception at the end and just be like, oh no, something bad happened, and maybe exit the application or something. But from here, the application can continue because, you know, it's easily recoverable type of event. So going forward, this I think right here is pretty important. So I have quite a bit of examples regarding this, but it's about loops. So when you're doing a loop, you have two choices. You can put the try outside of the loop, or you can put the try inside of the loop. So there's a big difference between the two. When I put the try outside of the loop, when an exception happens, it's going to go and hit the exception, right? Which is outside of the while loop, which means the while loop is now over. It will not continue. The rest of the code under it will continue. So I have a while loop, and it's iterating, or it's adding 1 to A every time, and it's printing A. And then it checks to see if A is 12. If A is 12, it makes it a string. And if A is 24, it breaks. So when A makes this a string, when it tries to add 1 to it, it's going to freak out because you can't add 1 to a string. It's just not compatible. So the exception is going to get raised. And I have right here A equals 12, so I'm just putting it back to an integer. It doesn't really matter. And I'm going to say print what A is. So what will happen here is I'm going to see that A equals 12 because the while loop got broken when it was when the exception was raised. So let's run that. So it made it to 12. Exception happened when it tried to do this, and it went to here. If I want it to keep going, because there's many cases where I would want this to keep going, I have a more specific example later. We can put the try inside of the while loop. So what I'm doing here is the same exact operation, except when A equals, or when I set A equal to 12 as a string, when the exception gets hit, I'm switching it back to 12 like I did up here, right? But because it's inside the while loop, when I switch it back to 12, the while loop is going to come back and then try to iterate back over it again. So in this case, it's going to get all the way through its full iteration and hit 24 and then break out normally. So let's print that. So the difference between the two, right, is one, the while loop gets broken. Maybe you want that to happen. Maybe if something like this happens, the while loop shouldn't continue. This one, it's going to continue. And if for whatever reason there keeps being issues, right, whatever's in that exception block is going to keep getting ran. So in this case, I'm kind of cheating. I'm setting A equal to 12 to just like force a recovery, but you probably wouldn't do that in your code. If an exception happens, you would pass on it and keep going, or you would do something like log it and keep going. There's a lot of things that you might do, but ultimately it could be a case where it shouldn't continue anymore because it'll never recover. So that's something that you'll have to figure out, like how you want to do that. Maybe if, you know, so actually let's go to the next example, and I'll show you a little bit more about what I mean. So in this example here, I'm doing a very similar thing, except I'm using a for loop, and I'm checking to see if these are digits, which essentially is if it's a string, but it's a number, it will check and it'll see if it is a number, it's a digit. If not, it's not. So I'm actually raising an error. Instead of it just happening from Python, I'm saying there's an error because it's just the easiest way to show you. But there would be other reasons why something might happen, right? So what this is trying to represent here is maybe you're getting user input from something, or you have a whole bunch of information that you need to go over. Maybe some of that information is bad, and I don't want to necessarily stop doing what I'm doing if I hit a bad section. I want to keep going. So let's run this. So when I did this check here, it determined, hey, A is not a digit. And so the else got hit and I rose, oh no, it's not a digit, right? So you could see in the command line right here, and that's the place of 7. But it still did 8 because the try is inside the for loop. So this is a good way to recover, right? Moving on, I'm going to do the same thing, but there's going to be a try on the inside and the outside. You might want both. Oops, I need to comment that. So I have a try block on the outside, right? And then I have this function right here getting a random integer between 1 and 100. And then I have another try block, and I'm saying if the number is less than 50, print. If it's not, raise an exception number is above 50. And I can raise whatever exception I want. Like up here, I raised a type error. Here, I'm just raising a blanket exception. It's just whatever I'm going to catch is what I'm going to catch. So I'm going to run this a couple times probably because it might take a while for it to happen. But what we're going to see here is that because I have this inner try block, it's going to handle the exception, and the outer one has no idea that it even happened. So if we were in a for loop even, and there was a try on the outside, this one would still recover, but maybe we can have some random one that would have it break or re-raise or something like that. So I'm going to show the re-raising thing on the next one. But this, we'll see that the inner is the only one that gets shown. Okay, so there we go. So just 3 times in a row, it said lower half. It said inner number is above 50. So a lot of times you're gonna have nested try blocks like this, especially if you put a function call in a try block and somewhere in that function there's another try block. Don't worry too much about it. Nesting is not really that big of a deal. It just depends on where you want the code to continue from. Because wherever that try is, that's where the code's going to continue onward from if you catch it correctly. So if you have one way up top and that's where you want it to go, you need to keep pushing it way up there and get it all the way back to the beginning. And you do that by re-raising the exception. So the last example here, I am re-raising the exception. So the only thing I need to do here that's different than the example before is I just put raise exception and then put the exception that I had back in there. So this one is going to go, okay, I got an exception, but I need to raise it again. And then it will jump to the outside. I have never really had to do this before because anytime I have an exception, I want to keep it where it's at. But a lot of times what I'll do is I'll pass the message up. So if I get an exception, I have more code that goes and it looks to see if I had one. And if it did, then it will print that message to the user. I'm not keep pushing it up. I'm just keeping that error around with me and going, oh, we had an error, okay. And then this checks, did we have an error? Oh, we did have an error. Here's the error. It makes it kind of more easy to manage in my opinion. So let me run this code. Let me uncomment this one. It might make it a little confusing. Okay, there we go. So we had an exception, number is above 50. We printed that exception, then we raised it again, and now we got it here. So in many cases, if you're raising it, you don't need to notify or do anything with this because you're just raising it back out here. So, but you might want something to happen locally before you re-raise it or whatever the case may be. I generally, like I said, don't do that, so I'm not really too good with coming up with an example of like how or why you would use that. I usually just look, and if I have an exception, I handle that locally, and then I will return something back saying the operation failed. If you like the video, please like and subscribe. It'll let me know whether I should be making more of this stuff or not. Also in the description, I'll have some links to things like my Twitch channel where I program live, as well as do network security stuff, pen testing, things like that. My notify.me, and any information related to like the operating system I use, text editor, and all that good stuff. Take it easy.